Welcome back to Fresh Outlook. Are Americans cowards when it comes to discussing race? Those are the words that Attorney General Eric Holder used when he discussed race relations. How can we create a dialogue on race, especially after this week's controversial ruling on stop and frisk?
The Obama administration unveils steps to fix what it considers the long-standing unjust treatment of many nonviolent drug offenders. Their plan aims to bypass tough mandatory prison terms while reducing America's large prison population and save billions of dollars.
It's clear as we come together today that too many Americans go to too many prisons for far too long and for no truly good law enforcement reason.
Attorney General Eric Holder said that the Justice Department would direct federal prosecutors.
This is why I have today mandated a modification of the Justice Department's charging policy so that certain low-level, nonviolent drug offenders who have no ties to large-scale organizations, gangs, or cartels will no longer be charged with offenses that impose draconian mandatory minimum sentences.
Prosecutors would do this by omitting from official charging documents the amount of drugs involved in a case. By doing so, prosecutors would ensure that nonviolent defendants without significant criminal histories would not get long sentences.
Now, we must never stop being tough on crime, but we must also be smart and efficient when battling crime and the conditions and the individual choices that breed it.
It is not clear how many offenders might see shorter prison terms under the administration's proposals, and the proposals are unlikely to affect many people already imprisoned.
We welcome back our panel. We also are joined by Dr. Bart Rossi. Thank you so much. Got a question for you, Kirk James, up there and via Skype from the University of Pennsylvania. Yeah, we just heard Holder saying something about the mandatory sentencing. How does that convey to the stop and frisk program that we've been talking about just in the last panel?
Well, I think it's also something that's been utilized very discriminatory. The majority of people that have actually been sentenced under mandatory sentences, such as, for instance, maybe the Rockefeller drug laws, which essentially mandated a life sentence for certain really small drug infractions, such as 2 to 4 ounces of cocaine, would actually earn someone a life sentence. The majority of people that are usually sentenced under these mandatory minimums are, overwhelmingly people of color, and specifically poor people of color. So I think it's really about time that we start to really examine some of these practices that we have in the United States.
And during the break, Dr. Tibbs, you and I were talking about stop and frisk, and you said that it's not going to go away,
right,
but it's going to change.
Yes.
If you could just give us a little bit of that history that
sure.
I was unaware of, if you can share that
so
with us.
Stop and frisk as a policy is constitutionally permissible. Prior to the 1960s, actually 1968, you had to have probable cause in order to stop someone and conduct a search of them via the Fourth Amendment. The Supreme Court in 1968, in its landmark decision of Terry versus Ohio, took probable cause off the table and said that a police officer can stop and put questions to anyone that he wants to. If then, through the process of asking and answering those questions, he develops reasonable suspicion that the individual might be engaging in criminal activity, he can actually pat the person down if the officer believes that the individual is carrying a weapon. After the pat down, if he feels something inside of the pockets that might amount to a weapon, then the police officer can reach inside. So in order for you to satisfy the Supreme Court's mandate for stop and frisk, you have several loopholes that you have to jump through, and the police in the NYPD and other cities are jumping over all of those steps to the very end, where they're grabbing individuals on the basis of something that is suspicion that does not amount to criminal activity, searching them, roughly treating them, and that is not what the Supreme Court intended.
Now, this is a controversial subject as well. Is the stop and frisk to blame for the higher incarceration rates?
I mean, I don't know if it's to blame for the higher incarceration rates, but certainly what it does is it puts more young African-American men in the disposal of the criminal justice system. And so there's a lot of things that can happen in the context of a police interaction. So what we're not talking about is resistance, right? It's very easy to be arrested for resisting the police. So if the police are violating your constitutional rights, for example, they grab your arm and they twist it in the wrong way. If you just switch your arm and move back against them, you're actually resisting the police, and then they can arrest you. That puts you in the criminal justice system, and that leads to incarceration.
And Dr. Bart, I just want to talk to you about what this does to, because we haven't heard from you just yet,
Right.
but what does this do, like, in terms of to the individual? You have said that you've been stopped many times. We just had one of our other guests previously say that he was stopped multiple times. What's that do to just the culture as a whole?
I think it does affect the culture. It affects the individual. I think people over time feel demeaned. They feel marginalized. They feel that, are they really part of society? And if we have 90-some% of the people that are frisked who have no involvement with any crime at all, there's something wrong with this picture. And I think that picture does reflect back on the individual.
Do you think
You're
our
right.
culture has become obsessed with over-policing and over-punishing?
Well, over-policing is an interesting one because we do need more protection, okay? But certainly punishment. These minimum sentences are ridiculous because the judge must sentence people when they're CDS prisoners, controlled dangerous substance, but they're not selling, they're using it themselves. So all these people are warehoused now as prisoners. It doesn't make any sense psychologically.
Kirk, what about you? Do you think that the culture has become obsessed with over-policing and over-punishing?
Of course. I think we're still not talking about the race issue here, right? I think if you look at, for instance, if you look at the majority of people that are incarcerated, they're not incarcerated for violent crimes. They're incarcerated for substance abuse usage, etc., right? Nonviolent crimes. The majority of them that are incarcerated are poor people of color again. Whereas all the research, in America demonstrates that, non-people of color use just as much drugs, but there's not that disproportionately level of arrest. I think the second thing we have to talk about is just even how policing takes place. Policing takes place in inner city neighborhoods at a very different rate than it takes place in white neighborhoods. And, we're not having those conversations. And even to talk about crime as a whole, I think that a lot of people are under the assumption that, we went from a prison population of 200,000 in 1970 to 2 million, over 2 million in 2000. And people are equating that with violent crime or other types of crimes. But that's not so. The crime rate has remained relatively the same. What has changed is the way that we police and the crimes that we've started to criminalize, specifically people who use drugs.
New discussions about how we police. There's now 1.5 million people in jail. 17 states are getting away from putting people in prison, and they're talking about a new approach called Smart on Crime. And this is targeting the most serious offenses. And Dee Dee, your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to say that, I think that certainly the time should fit the crime. When we're talking about drug substance, it sounds like that is a little harsh, and that needs to change. But that's more about the crime versus, who is being targeted. And again, I just think that the over-policing thing, especially when you're talking about New York, is unfair because there's so many more people here, and you have to have more policing, and it has to be stricter. And you were talking about the statistics. Everyone here keeps talking about, well, the crime rate's gone down. Well, I think it's probably because of stop-and-frisk. That's what Ray Kelly says, and it makes sense.
Final thoughts on this?
To Dee Dee's point here, I think that prisoners, most of them are not violent. So why do we have the non-violent people make up the majority of prisoners? There's a problem here.
Yeah. Dr.
So,
Tibbs?
so let's take the woman in Florida that was just sentenced to 20 years under the 1020 law there that requires that because she fired her gun in her own home just to scare off her husband who was attacking her. Because of the mandatory sentencing law, she's going to spend 20 years in prison for standing her ground.
That's terrible.
That should really make everyone say, wow, okay, this is a problem, because this is a lady who was being abused. She was trying to get away from that abusive relationship, and she only went back into the house to get her gun because she left the keys in the house so that she could actually leave.
And Kirk, we have one last thought from you.
I just think that we need to base a lot of these policies on really informed practices. And I think we're not doing that. And I think something that's really scary, right? We've created this culture of incarceration. We've incarcerated more people than any other country in the history of this world, right? And I think we really need to stop and examine that. I think, you know, when you look at this country, unfortunately, you have to look at some of the things that occurred in the past. And I think the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, right? But it also legalized slavery for incarceration. And I mean, we're looking at this thing, we're looking at the criminal justice system, and the majority of people that are incarcerated are people of color. So unless you're going to tell me that all people of color are criminal, I think we really need to examine this system.
Oh, Kirk, thank you so much for your insights on this. Dr. Tibbs, always a pleasure. Dr. Bart, you're going to stick around with us, and so are you, Dee Dee. And don't you go away, everyone. We're going to lighten things up next and break out the popcorn and talk about the best summer flicks of 2013.